Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Transition Innovations Promising Vocational Rehabilitation Practices for Youth. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets that you can use. You can expand each widget window or widget by clicking on the Maximize icon at the top right of the widget or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available one day after the webcast at the same audience link used for today's webcast. A copy of today's slide deck is in the resource list widget that looks like a green file icon at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for presenters during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question there. We will try to address as many questions as possible during this event, but if a fuller answer is required or we run out of time, your question will be answered later via email. We do capture all questions. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. However, you can also submit technical questions through the Q&A widget. Now I'd like to pass it over to Todd Honeycutt. Todd, you now have the floor.
Thanks, Bryce. I'm Todd Honeycutt, a senior researcher at Mathematica. Thank you for joining us today, and a special welcome for those of you attending with your parents and guardians as part of Take Your Daughters and Sons to Work Day. This webinar is one in a recurring series sponsored by the Center for Studying Disability Policy at Mathematica Policy Research. Mathematica established the center in 2007 to provide the nation's leaders with the data necessary to shape disability policy and programs to fully meet the needs of all Americans with disabilities. Vocational Rehabilitation Agencies, or VR agencies, increasingly demand better evidence-based practices in their work with transition-age youth. The needs of youth ages 14 to 24 who are transitioning from school to work differ from those of adults regarding skill building and exposure to the world of work, and so they require alternative approaches than those used by adults. However, also pressing for VR agencies are new requirements from the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. These requirements, which include working with groups of students, serving students before they apply for VR services, spending 15% of federal funding on pre-employment transition services, are forcing agencies to work more with high school students and at an earlier point than in the past. All of these aspects of VR agencies' work with youth raise questions about what services are effective and how to equip staff to deliver these services efficiently and consistently. I'm pleased today to have three experts from the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on VR practices for youth and young adults to present on transition innovations for VR agencies. This RRTC, funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, is led by Transcend with its partners from the University of Maryland, the Institute of Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, the Council for State Administrators of Vocational Rehabilitation, and Mathematica. The purpose of the RRTC is to address the gaps between knowledge and practice in ways that can improve VR practices so that youth and young adults can have better employment and education outcomes. Our three presenters today are Richard Luking from the University of Maryland, who will discuss VR counselors' experiences with effective VR practices, Meg Griegel from ICI, who will present on unique partnerships between VR agencies and higher education programs to encourage the post-secondary educational involvement of students with intellectual disabilities and autism, and Purvi Savak from Mathematica, who will talk about her research on the early implementation experiences of VR agencies with pre-employment transition services. We're very glad to have David Test from the University of North Carolina join us as our discussant. Dr. Test is a leader in evidence-based practices for transition-age youth and is a co-project director of the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, or NTACT. With our introductions out of the way, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Rich Luking.
Thank you, Todd. Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about a study that we recently conducted at the University of Maryland. I did it with my colleagues Ellen Fabian and Deb Newbert there. And we wanted to look at VR transition practices in, quote, high-performing states, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. The reason we conducted this study was because, as Todd already mentioned, the WIOA creates some changes in the way services are delivered to students and youth with disabilities, and it requires new activities for vocational rehabilitation or VR counselors. And among those, as already mentioned by Todd, is authorizing services before school exit, which requires more direct and intensive collaboration between schools and their partners. And of course, the pre-employment transition services, or Pre-ETS, are a preeminent vehicle through which those services are delivered. And there are 5 categories of Pre-ETS that counselors are able to authorize and or provide, including job exploration counseling, work readiness training, work-based learning experiences, counseling on post-secondary education opportunities, and self-advocacy instruction. So we wanted to know, in the context of what WIOA is now requiring, we wanted to know 3 things. And if somebody could advance to the next slide, that would be helpful. We wanted to know we wanted to identify the importance of transition-related activities to VR counselors from, quote, high-performing states. The second thing we wanted to find out was what are the differences between what counselors perceive to be important in delivering these services and their preparation to perform them. And the third thing we wanted to do was identify barriers to implementing effective transition practices that counselors identified. So if you can go again to the next slide. Participants. We ended up interviewing counselors from 13 states. These were states identified by Todd Honeycutt and his colleagues in a study which identified what states had the highest percentage of successful, or the highest number of successful closure rates for youth, and those that would qualify those states as being high performing in that they seem to be more successful than other states in serving this population. And so out of these 13 states, we were able to interview almost a third of the possible counselors that were available to participate, 538 out of a total possible of over 1,600 counselors. They completed the survey. It's important to note that of the counselors we served, 70% had caseloads composed of at least 25% students and youth, and 16%, a sizable minority, served exclusively students and youth. So we felt this was a good sample from which to get their perspectives because they had pretty intensive contact with youth. In fact, some of them have exclusive contact with youth. The rest of the survey respondents only served less than 25%. But most of it, almost all of the 86% of the respondents had a pretty high level of services to youth. So the instrument we used to survey them, we called it the VR Transition Practices Scales. It's a 35-item survey which has respondents ranked between 1 and 4 on a Likert scale, their perceptions of importance of the item, and their perceptions of their preparation to perform that skill on the item. These scales were derived from previous surveys that Plotner et al. Had developed, as well as Kierpiek. And then in addition to deriving our survey from theirs, we had a national expert review of our survey to make sure that we were asking the right questions. I won't have time today to go through what all those questions were, but I'll highlight the key answers that we received, and I'll give you information at the end of this presentation about where you might get more detail if you desire to get it. So, and then in addition to their perceptions, of course, we wanted to find out what they thought were major barriers in serving students and youth from a drop-down menu of 12 items, which included, among other things, collaboration, local employment opportunities, disability severity, and a number of other factors relating to serving youth. So the analysis, if you go to the next slide, please. It was pretty straightforward. We took the means and percentages and standard deviations from each of the 35 items. And then we also, in order to explore the effects of caseload specialization, which I'll talk about later, we did a multivariate analysis of variance to explore the differences. So the next slide. So here's the results. I'll start talking about those. And again, this will be an abbreviated presentation because of the time we have today. But the most important skills that counselors identified, in fact, all of the items were rated at least moderately important. In other words, at least 3.0 on a 4.0 scale. But the highest rated skill that they thought was most important was job exploration counseling, which is a 3.8 average score. And the lowest rated was collaborating with LEAs on evaluating post-school outcomes. Again, they were all recognized, identified as being at least moderately important, but those were the highest and the lowest ratings, which doesn't tell us a whole lot until you look at the next slide, because here is where the counselors talked about their preparation to perform skills. So all the items on the survey were rated lower for preparation than importance. In other words, the counselors saw these things as important, but they also perceived themselves as less prepared to deliver these services or engage in these skills in serving the youth. So, for example, the highest rated item was developing an individual plan for employment. Counselors felt that they were prepared. They scored an average of 3.2 on a 4.0 scale as to their perceptions of their ability to carry out that skill. In other words, that was the highest average skill that was identified that they perceived they had. Tellingly, the lowest rated skill that they identified was their ability to involve employers in the transition process. In fact, that average is only 2.5 out of 4. So the significance of that, I hope, is becoming apparent. I'll tell you a little bit more about that toward the end. But obviously, if one of the pre-ETS is work experiences, and work experiences depend on employers to be available to provide those opportunities, then being able to involve them in the transition process is a really important skill that, in this survey at least, counselors felt that they were least prepared to do. So if you go to the next slide, the differences between importance and perception, in fact, all of these, the difference in all of the items, as I said, and to reiterate the point I just made, the biggest differences between importance and perception were involving employers, securing and offering work-based experiences, and then another item was collaboration with workforce centers, otherwise known as the American Job Centers. These are particularly useful resources for summer youth employment and youth employment activities, and there was a big difference between what they felt they were prepared to do there and how important it was. And then finally, go to the next slide, the results about barriers to effective practice. The most frequently cited barrier was the lack of time for caseload management. And in other words, as is typical in the VR world, large caseloads created a big problem or a perceived problem in having enough time to give the attention to the cases that were needed. Also, a commonly cited barrier was also cited here, lack of transportation, and then finally lack of employment options in the area. So the next slide, the interesting difference, however, was seen in those counselors who had a specialized caseload. In other words, those counselors who only serve youth, students and youth, they, compared to counselors who served fewer students, they perceived fewer barriers in 4 categories, and I think these are really telling. They were less likely to see the severity of the disability as a barrier. Another way to say that would be that they were more likely to see youth with employment challenges as employable. They also identified, they were less likely to identify lack of cooperation with local education agencies or LEAs or schools and service providers. Again, the presumption there is that they're working with schools exclusively and doing a lot of work directly with schools, and therefore, as a result of that frequent collaboration, see that as less of a barrier. And then their need for additional training, and it was also identified as less problematic. And they also saw that there was less of a barrier in engaging youth successfully than other counselors saw. So again, this has the implications about caseload specifications, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So if you go to applications, the next slide, the implications of all of this, just in kind of a short form, a way of presenting it, is that, first of all, there's a gap between what counselors see as important and what they see as their preparation to perform these basic skills or these important skills, which has implications for counselor training and counselor education, and both pre-service education for counselors and in-service training. And that, as I kind of hinted at earlier, caseload specifications may mitigate some of these barriers. In other words, the more counselors specialize in serving students and youth, the more familiar they are likely to be with their needs and more likely to be successful in engaging and serving them. And so the next slide, further implications, again, relating to what counselors need to know and how they should be trained and how their partners and collaborators should also be trained, is that we need to develop more capacity for securing paid employment. As I mentioned before, one of the key differences between perception of importance and the perception of their ability to perform was in the area of engaging employers. So securing paid employment and engaging employers were two prominent areas that are implied by this survey. And, of course, coordinating with the American Job Centers. So these don't answer all the questions. I think one of the key things that we can take away from this is that as VR agencies are considering how best to serve youth students and youth with disabilities, of course, caseload specialization might be something to look at, as might be the training that not only counselors but their collaborators receive in engaging employers might be at the top of the list. So if you go to the next slide, this implies that, as we learn about how counselors go about this, we need to find out more. And so future research, it would be important to look at how we can better understand the perceived challenges and how does caseload specialization really hold as a recommended way to go here. And also, we did not look at specific categories of pre-ETS by counselors and their effectiveness, and this begs for more close research about how these are used by counselors and how effective they might be. So currently, my colleagues Ellen Fabian and Deb Newbert and I at the University of Maryland are doing this exact thing, doing a second phase of this study and going back and interviewing counselors who participated in this survey directly by phone to get more detailed information on these activities so that we can be better informed about counselors' perceptions on these issues. So stay tuned for that. We're in the middle of our analysis of those interviews, and that will further inform some of the activities that I described that were part of this study. So if you go to the last slide in my presentation, there's a brief that the RRTC that Todd introduced at the beginning of this presentation that summarizes the research I just talked about. If you click on this website address, vrpracticesandyouth.org, which is the website of the RRTC, and then go to the studies, VR practices, and center publications, you'll find our brief there that briefly summarizes what I talked about today. And if you're interested in getting more detailed information and want to look at the entirety of our study and the survey items and so forth, there will be a full study published. It's in press right now in the Rehabilitation Research Policy and Education Journal. So stay tuned for that. So that concludes my presentation. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Meg Griegel so that she can present her important study, and I'll step aside for her now.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everybody. This is Meg Griegel from the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Today I'm going to share some information about some case studies we conducted on effective partnerships between vocational rehabilitation and higher education programs for students with intellectual disability and autism. Before I get too far into the study, I'm going to share a little bit of background information on the current status of higher education programs for students with intellectual disability and autism, for those of you on the call who may or may not be involved in the field of inclusive higher education. Over the past 14 years, we've seen a very significant growth in the number of institutes of higher education that are serving students with intellectual disability and with autism. The graph I'm showing now shows that substantial change has really happened since 2009, where there were 149 programs, and now on our college search directory, and the website is on this slide, you can see we have 266 programs that are colleges and universities that have indicated they're serving students with intellectual disability. Much of this change has resulted from the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in 2008 in terms of the Higher Education Opportunities Act. This piece of legislation created multiple outcomes that impacted the access to higher ed for students with ID and autism. It created something called the Comprehensive Transition Program, which is a Title IV access point, which allowed students with intellectual disability for the first time to be eligible to receive federal student aid. It also established funding for model demonstration projects and a coordinating center. It required the development of new model accreditation standards for inclusive higher education programs serving these students. And it allowed for the collection of program and student-level data for the first time. Much of those data were collected through the model demonstration projects. These projects, the acronym, what is a TPSID? Transition and Post-Secondary Programs for Students with Intellectual Disabilities is the name of the model demonstration projects that were funded through the Office of Post-Secondary Education at the Department of Education. And of course, since it's around disability, we need a good acronym, so we have TPSIDs. It's not the best acronym, but they are fantastic programs, and there have been, over the past 8 years, 27 projects were funded in 2010. Those ended in 2015. Another 25 projects were funded in 2015, and they'll run through 2020. We at Think College serve as the National Coordinating Center for all of the projects that were funded. In that role, we were able to work with programs all over the country. Here you see a map of where all of the TPSID grantees were over the course of the 10-year funding period. In some cases, programs that were a part of the first cohort were also a part of the second cohort, and they're indicated on this map as yellow stars. The others were either funded in the first or second cohort. Finally, the reason that these TPSIDs are critical to today's discussion is that the National Coordinating Center was able to collect data on over 2,700 students who received services on over 88 different college and university campuses, which really gives us our first national and somewhat longitudinal picture of what's happening in these higher ed programs. And one critical aspect of what's happening in these programs was who they partnered with. The National Coordinating Center was able to collect data on every course students took, the credentials they attained, their career development and employment experiences, whether or not and how they participated in residence life, and what their status was at exit. And we are currently collecting some follow-up data as well. So beginning with that picture and knowing that one of the critical aspects of these programs is their partnership with vocational rehabilitation, we were able to look at the data and discern the extent to which these programs were partnering with VR. And as you can see, in general, we saw a significant portion of the programs partnered with VR, 77% of the projects. And this is based on the first cohort of data, not the second cohort of data. And you can see on a formal basis, over 80% either met monthly or quarterly. So there was a significant amount of partnership. And in a previous study that I think we presented on the last Mathematica policy webinar, we shared the findings from our quantitative study. But what that doesn't allow us to see is how these partnerships were developed and what they look like and why they are working for the various entities involved. So that's why we conducted these case studies. The case studies were a way for us to dig a little deeper and find out how the partnerships were established and what we can glean from them in terms of improving best practice, both for inclusive higher ed and vocational rehabilitation. So how did we choose who we talked to? Well, it was a little bit of quantitative and qualitative. We did look at the data to ensure that there was evidence of a VR partnership and the level of engagement that was taking place, because it was important for us to ensure that these partnerships actually resulted in the desired goal, which for both VR and the higher ed program would be employment. We looked at employment outcomes of the students who were being served by these partnerships. But in addition to that, we really needed to look at some qualitative information, how long the partnership had been sustained, if it changed over time, the extent to which the state-level VR was aware of the more local or regional partnership that was happening with this institution of higher education. And then, of course, the partners had to be willing to host us for a site visit. So who we ended up talking to were 4 higher education programs. 4 were serving adult students, meaning they had left the K-12 system. 1 was serving transition-aged youth through an inclusive dual enrollment transition program. And the programs varied in their length. 1 was a 4-year program, and a few were 2-year programs and then 4-year programs. The participants reflected junior college, 1 college that provided both 2- and 4-year degrees, and then 2 were 4-year colleges. So our team conducted 2 to 3 day site visits, and we would have 1 to 3 people with us, depending on how many people we were talking to. And we were able to interview a really wide array of stakeholders, including program staff, vocational rehabilitation counselors, their supervisors, as well as students who are attending the program and their parents. So from these case studies, we were able to identify a number of strategies for effective collaboration. And I will say, I think there's 4 that I'm going to share with you today. I think we have more than 12. So as we move forward with getting this information out, hopefully we'll be able to connect with each of you another time to tell you our full picture of our findings. So one of the things we found that was really critical was that each of the partners understand each other's goals. The institution of higher education that's serving the student is really looking at the big picture of the student. What classes are they taking? How are they participating in campus activities and organizations and clubs? If they're living on campus, what that situation is bringing into their goals, and then their employment, whether it's career development, employment, internships, or a combination of each. And because they have that big picture and a longer-term goal of hoping the student will be employed when they leave the program, that's a very different path than the traditional vocational rehabilitation involvement, which focuses more on short-term employment outcomes. So having conversations about each other's goals and the pieces that are critical to ensure you're meeting your mission, those conversations have to happen for these partners to work well together. One IHE staff member indicated a VR agency is a very different thing than a university, so you need to be aware and respectful of the differences. A VR personnel shared with VR, we always put it into the perspective of how it relates to employment, it's helpful to be aware of the academic schedules and the rhythms of the college campus. So some of the ways that these partners enhance their understanding of each other's goals was sometimes just to review them, sitting down and actually articulating at a granular level what they need to achieve and during what time period. Articulating those performance measures is another way to do it. Some programs held a get-to-know-you meeting. In other cases, to ensure that they'd have a good understanding of the context in which they were doing this work, they would vary where their meetings were hosted. So sometimes they'd host it at the VR office, sometimes they'd host it at the college. And another piece, and I think this aligns a little bit with what Rich was sharing, they would establish a relationship with a specific individual who had a certain kind of background, expertise, or interest in working with the kind of youth that they were supporting. So I think that's interesting that our studies are overlapping in that area. Oh, sugar. I thought I hit the button and then I didn't. All right, so another strategy that really helped with effective partnership was creating formal meeting and communication structures. Now, I'm sure this doesn't surprise any of you on this call because we know that's the only way for us to move this forward. And the previous slide where I showed that VR and IHE staff met either monthly or quarterly demonstrated that our hard data supported this. And here's some reflections. We meet quarterly with VR staff at the management level, and then monthly or every other month with the counselors just to check in about each student. In order for the partnerships to work, just having those meetings isn't always sufficient, and people involved in the case study indicated some other activities that could enhance their formal collaborations, and these included serving on advisory boards, developing cooperative agreements or memorandums of understanding, including other partners to join existing committees, or creating a joint agency or ad hoc committee to address a certain short-term issue when they're trying to achieve success. So in addition to the formal communication, we found that informal communication was also really critical, and this didn't show up in our hard data. So I thought this was really striking in the case study data. We received a lot of input that VR and IHE staff were talking constantly. Here's a few short reflections. The VR point person and I probably email 3 or 4 times a day at least. The biggest tool that we have that VR appreciates is that we communicate and we have a relationship with them. And finally, I'm communicating with VR counselors probably several times a week, mostly emails, but phone calls if things need to move faster. So this ongoing communication really allows these partners to talk about certain issues, to be really responsive when there's an issue or problem impacting a particular student, and it also helps them really create a relationship. And I think this quote is reflective of that. So that personal relationship, I think, is as important as what does the contract say or what we are required to do. That we feel that we feel like a team, and there's real affection between us. And we did find in these case studies that the relationships had evolved over time, and while there might have been some fear or a little disconnect as they began, over time they really did work through their kinks and did see themselves as working on the same team. Another finding that we came across was that it was critical that students were connected to both partners, and that was not always the case. This is reflected by this IHE staff person. All of our students that come in, we always tell them, educate the families and the individuals about VR as a resource for them. At some point in their life, there's a lot of families there's a lot of times when families don't, for some reason, even know anything about VR. We do a lot of educating of families. So if a family is being referred by the VR agency to the program, obviously they're already on the VR agency's radar. But that wasn't always the case, and in many cases it was important for the IHE program staff to actually inform parents about what VR was, how they could be connected to it, and actually help them with the paperwork to begin that process. And speaking of paperwork, I bet you're not surprised to see the word documentation and case study findings. What we found is that they realized that it was important to ensure that the documentation meted everyone's needs. And the way that higher ed programs collect, gather, and share their data is very different from the way vocational rehabilitation collects and shares their data. So the IHE, here's a sample of what the perspective from the college was. With VR, when they're going to financially support our students, there are several things that VR has to have. So our job is to get all that paperwork to VR so it goes as smooth as possible. And here's an example from VR, how they were flexible to meet the college's needs. Typically with our contracts, they want a monthly placement report, but that is not just really practical for a college student. So we've asked for a progress report at the mid-semester and at the end of the semester for all students. So talking through those documentation needs and then being flexible when it's possible is a critical aspect to these effective partnerships. One final example, if I start working with a student and we find them a job, I send VR the employment information about who they work for and who the manager is. What's their start date to give VR an anticipated successful closure date. So that really reflects an understanding on behalf of the higher education professional that vocational rehabilitation has some requirements that for them to be on top of it and do the outreach necessary so VR can cover their bases. So a few things, and that wraps up the strategies I'm going to share. Very quickly, the context in which these partnerships are occurring is really in flux. So many of these partnerships had been established over a long period of time, and as the higher education programs emerged or changed, those partnerships too had to change. And now we're in a situation where we have new higher education programs that are proliferating either through funding under the OPE, the Office of Postsecondary Education, or through other funding efforts. And at the same time, we have new vocational rehabilitation guidance under the WIOA that are still, I think, being worked out in the field. So there's a little bit of uncertainty related to the nature and structure of these partnerships, especially in the context of pre-employment transition services and some of the newly established credential requirements that we'll have to work through and be very transparent about how we're addressing each of these things. I feel that higher education partnerships with vocational rehabilitation have huge benefits and significant positive employment outcomes for the students who are involved with both. But there is a lot of communication work that has to happen to make them as effective as possible. So the big picture of the findings I just shared was really that each of these partners have to honor and understand both of the systems they're representing. They need to be flexible and responsive, both in terms of paperwork and in understanding how they can and will meet their respective goals. They must engage and communicate regularly, both formally and informally, and have clear expectations and roles about who's going to do what and by when to ensure that the students achieve their goals. So if you're interested in this and you'd like to continue talking to people who are really engaged in inclusive higher education and vocational rehabilitation, my colleague Russ Talene at Think College runs an affinity group. It's an online group where they discuss issues and strategies about these partnerships. So I'd welcome you to contact us and join that group if you're interested. There's a couple of briefs and fast facts available on the RRTC website, which is listed at the bottom of this slide. There's more information at Think College as well. And if you have a question or concern around inclusive higher education, we would love to answer your questions, so please send us an email or get in touch. And with that, I'm done with sharing our slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Purvi Savak.
Thank you, Meg. I'm Purvi Savak, and I'm going to talk today about state VR agencies' early implementation experiences with pre-employment transition services. So as we've already heard, WIOA newly mandates a provision of Pre-ETS to all potentially eligible students with disabilities. VR agencies are tasked with supplementing rather than replacing transition services that schools may already provide under IDEA. I'll start by defining who is this potentially eligible population. Pre-ETS must be made available to all students with a disability who are enrolled in a recognized educational setting. In most states, this includes students that are 14 to 21 years of age. So the population that VR agencies have to serve with Pre-ETS includes students who have applied to VR, but also a much larger population that is potentially eligible for VR services. As Rich shared in his presentation, there are 5 required pre-employment transition services. So I won't go over what those are again, they're listed here. We studied the early implementation experiences of 10 state VR agencies in implementing Pre-ETS. These include Alabama, Alaska, Missouri General, New Jersey General, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, Washington, and West Virginia. So while these are not a random sample of states, they do cover a good geographic breadth of the United States. We collected information from structured interviews, presentations of agency staff, and reports. We also use counts from 6 states on Pre-ETS authorizations. Our findings build on a report from early 2017 by the National Council on Disability, which identified a number of challenges that agencies were experiencing as they were setting up implementation of Pre-ETS. The WIOA requirements represent a significant change for agencies. As a result, there were a number of challenges. We identified a number of common challenges that agency staff mentioned. First, staff mentioned that their agencies were constrained by the fact that they cannot authorize support services for potentially eligible students who are not VR clients. So this includes services like transportation or purchases of technology and equipment. In many cases, these are services or things that students may need to take part in some of the Pre-ETS activities. For example, work-based learning experiences might require transportation for a student to a work site. As a result, some agencies mentioned that they plan to encourage all potentially eligible students to apply for VR services so that the agency can provide those support services that might be necessary to take part in Pre-ETS. Second, most agencies reported that they faced capacity constraints in expanding services to this much larger population of youth. As a result, I'll share a number of examples of new collaborations that VR agencies have made with local school districts and community-based organizations to expand the services that they can deliver and relax this capacity constraint. Third, many staff mentioned that they were facing challenges in tracking the need at the school district level or the school level for Pre-ETS, and also the receipt of pre-employment transition services. We asked agency staff who provides Pre-ETS, and we found that VR agencies are using a mix of both traditional and non-traditional methods to deliver pre-employment transition services. Traditional service providers include VR agency staff, like counselors, and also contracted service providers, like CRPs and ILCs. Some examples of new non-traditional contracted service providers include teachers that might be delivering Pre-ETS as an after-school activity, which we saw in Alaska, staff at state universities. This is an example that the state of Missouri was using. And in Pennsylvania, the state hired social workers as new early reach coordinators to provide outreach in schools. This figure shows the share of authorizations to VR eligible and potentially eligible students. Agencies differed in their timing of when they began to provide services to this new population of potentially eligible youth. Among the 6 states that provided quantitative data separately for VR eligible and potentially eligible students, the share of Pre-ETS that was authorized for potentially eligible students varies widely. These differences are partly due to the fact that many of these agencies were already providing services that could be considered Pre-ETS in the pre-WIOA period, but they reflect a number of different contextual factors across the agencies. In Alabama, Alaska, Missouri, and Washington, VR agencies provided a greater proportion of Pre-ETS to potentially eligible students rather than VR eligible students during this time period. And I should mention again that this time period that we're looking at for these authorizations is up to the end of September 2017. So for most of these agencies, this covered the period of July, August, and September of 2017. But for 2 of these agencies, the data reflects the full prior year. In North Carolina and Ohio, a greater proportion of Pre-ETS, or all of the Pre-ETS in Ohio authorizations, were for VR eligible students. Because of the challenge presented by simultaneously providing these new services and reaching these new populations, these 2 agencies waited until this current school year to scale up delivery of Pre-ETS to potentially eligible students. We found that most agencies delivered a subset of Pre-ETS rather than all of the services equally in the early implementation period. And this figure shows the relative shares of authorized Pre-ETS across the 5 categories. Using data from the 6 states that provided counts on authorizations separately for the individual Pre-ETS, we find that agencies vary in the delivery of specific services, though the majority focus service delivery on direct work-related services, which are workplace readiness training, job exploration counseling, and work-based learning experiences. Of these 6 states, Missouri and Washington provided all 5 services relatively equally, while Alabama, Alaska, Ohio, and Pennsylvania provided a higher proportion of the direct work-related Pre-ETS. We asked agency staff if their agencies prioritized particular Pre-ETS because we saw that workplace readiness training and job exploration counseling were the most frequently authorized services. So one explanation that was given was that these 2 Pre-ETS can be provided in larger groups, whereas work-based learning experiences are much more resource intensive because they require collaboration with employers, and students often need transportation, which I mentioned earlier can be a challenge for potentially eligible but not VR eligible youth. The relative provision of specific Pre-ETS also depended on offerings of their existing service providers. So in some cases, the agencies had not identified providers to provide 1 or more of the services yet. 3 of the 10 agencies we studied created Pre-ETS pathways, which reflect a sequence of services for students to follow as they progress through high school and develop maturity and experience. Here we illustrate Ohio's Progressive Career Development Pathway. It starts with Summer Youth Career Exploration, which can include a variety of educational programming to youth ages 15 and older. It is an example of the Pre-ETS of job exploration counseling. In the next summer, students can get Summer Youth Work Experience, which contains a mix of both educational and work components. It uses the school and the workplace to provide the Pre-ETS of workplace readiness training. The pathway culminates with Summer Youth Job Development. It includes independent summer work activities using temporary placement and real work sites. It's an example of the Pre-ETS of work-based learning experiences. Many staff we spoke to described how work-based learning experiences seem to be the most appropriate for older students, those that are close to graduation, and it's also the Pre-ETS that has the most support in the literature. So this is consistent with Ohio's pathway culminating with the work-based learning experience. I'm going to finish by sharing some examples of new programs to deliver Pre-ETS that illustrate some innovations that the agencies have taken. First, Texas's Summer Earn and Learn program. This is a paid work-based learning experience that also provides workplace readiness training. This program is a model for expanding scale through partnerships. VR contracts here with local workforce boards to provide the services and placements, while VR provides referrals, case management, and supporting services. In the summer of 2017, 1,500 students participated in the Summer Earn and Learn, and Texas plans to double the number of students in 2018. Alaska has something called the Alaska Jobs Club. These clubs are after-school activities that provide workplace readiness training. The clubs follow a 7-module curriculum that focuses on soft skills like communication and teamwork. In this program, VR uses the teachers at the schools as vendors as a way to expand the reach of VR. So given that many schools in Alaska are remote and not easily accessible by VR, by leveraging the teachers in each of these schools, VR can expand their reach to provide pre-ETS at schools, at residential psychiatric facilities, in remote rural towns, and also in urban areas. Missouri has something called the Groundhog Job Shadow Month, which is a month-long work-based learning experience in February. This month-long experience provides VR the opportunity to cover all 5 of the pre-ETS in the context of an industry of the student's interest. This program is an illustrative example of collaboration between VR and school districts, pre-ETS specialists at the State University in Missouri, and local businesses. The industries they cover are pretty diverse, including libraries, restaurants, manufacturing facilities, grocers, and medical centers. So to conclude, or just to summarize, agencies have used a wide variety of approaches in implementing pre-ETS. Some have delayed expansion to potentially eligible students to this current school year. Some have incrementally expanded provision of particular pre-ETS. A number of agencies have developed partnerships with new providers, organizations, and businesses to expand their reach and meet this this challenge. As agencies continue to scale up delivery of pre-ETS, we think they can look to other agencies for models of innovative approaches. We've put our findings on the study in an issue brief that is available at the Youth RRTC website. The link is here on this slide. And my contact information is also here if you want to ask me additional questions. I'm going to hand it over now to our discussant, David Test.
Thank you, Purvi, and Meg, and Rich. Rich, I think this is probably the first presentation I've ever seen where you didn't put up your work is good slide. I was thinking of doing that, but decided not to. I'm Dave Test. I'm one of the co-directors, as Todd said, of NTACT, and I'm a professor here at UNC Charlotte in special education. For those of you that don't know about NTACT, we are co-funded by both the Office of Special Education Programs and by the Rehabilitation Services Administration. So we are the only co-funded transition technical assistance center. So as you can see, our purpose, because of that, we work with both state education agencies, local education agencies, state VR agencies, and the local VR service providers. And our main charge is to help them implement evidence-based and promising practices for students with disabilities. So that's a little bit of background on me, and just in case you didn't have it. But as I was listening today, there's one big thing that jumped out at me, and that is that the need, I think, for interagency collaboration. I think Rich mentioned it from the very beginning that VR counselors indicated a need for improving collaboration, and particularly with employers and American Job Centers. Meg talked about what makes for good collaboration between institutes of higher education and VR, things like understanding the goals and systems of each other's, and the need for formal meeting and communication structures. And Parvi talked about the need between VR and pre-employment transitions services providers, people, the LEAs, the local education agencies, teachers, institutes of higher ed, community providers. So it was, that to me struck me that the need for interagency collaboration. So what do you do about that? Well, fortunately, there are a couple of emerging models that have actual research on them to show that they may be effective models of interagency collaboration. The first one is the Maryland Seamless Transition Collaborative, and I didn't put the acronym on here, sorry Meg, but it's MYSTIC. And MYSTIC is obviously it's built around seamless transition. The MYSTIC student services flow chart starts at 10th grade or 3 years prior to exit if they're not going to exit with their peers. And it continues for 2 years beyond exiting high school. It starts at the beginning with the discovery process, which VR people should be well aware of, to then document a positive personal profile, which we'll get into an IEP and later an IPE. And the intervention components include things like self-determination and self-advocacy, work-based learning experiences, student-led IEP, family support, health and social linkages, and public benefits management. So that's a really good interagency collaboration strategy to look at. Another one that has data behind it is CIRCLES. And that actually stands for something called Communicating Interagency Relationships and Collaborative Linkages for Exceptional Students, but CIRCLES is much easier to say. And here, CIRCLES has 3 levels of collaboration. One is a community level team, one is a school level team, and one is the IEP team. Pretty much many communities already have a community level team that is made up of the leaders of different organizations within a county often. Sometimes just the city, but they're the guys that deal with budgets and programming, but they don't provide direct services. Although in some smaller and rural communities they do the same thing. They do both. But the school level team and then the IEP team, everybody knows what an IEP team is. In terms of the school level team, that's the difference. And a school level team is a group of school system people and community providers. VR counselors are definitely important, but there'll be others that meet probably monthly and meet with a group of students. And the students present to the group, and then they sit down and talk with the group in terms of, here's what I want to do when I leave school, and then the agencies talk about, what services and supports they can provide and what services and supports may match best with the student and the family. And then that information then gets taken back and put in the IEP. So this is a sort of a pre-IEP meeting that once this stuff is signed off on, if it gets in the IEP meeting, then the VR counselor doesn't have to go to all the meetings unless something changes. So it's a good way of community agencies, direct service providers, being able to get with a lot of students rather than going to all these individual IEP meetings. And that's, so far, CIRCLES has worked pretty well in a number of different states. So those are 2 models. There are a couple of other things that as I was listening, I noticed. I think it's going to be really important into the future that there's ongoing joint VR and special ed professional development. When I looked at Parvi's diagram of the Ohio Pre-ETS sequence, the terminology that was in the blue boxes was probably special ed terminology, and down below were what the pre-ETS were, and they always didn't match. So while we may be thinking about the same thing, we're not calling it the same thing. So terminology, funding, all these things about understanding each other's goals and systems, those are things that will happen in the Maryland, in a Mystic model or in circles where you have direct service providers working with each other and learning what each other does. I've been in circles meetings where a certain person couldn't come, say the VR counselor couldn't come that day, but everybody else could then step to the plate and talk about what VR does and what services are available because they'd heard it so many times. So that's going to be, I think, a real need into the future is making sure that we're not siloing our professional development, but we're doing it joint. And I think another piece of information that that collaboration can be around will be the need for a collaborative data collection systems. Right now, we know about IDEA's indicators, or you may have heard about them. The 4 transition ones are 1 is graduation rates, and 2 is dropout rates, 13 is the IEP components, and 14 is the post-school outcomes, which many of you have an impact on. So those data are being used by school systems to look at what they're doing in terms of program development and program modification. So using it as database decision-making tools for program development. And then as WIOA gets going, there's going to be a set of common performance measures. And so both systems, special ed and VR, are going to need to collaborate around gathering those data and sharing those data with schools so schools and states can make ongoing database decision-makings about how to provide the best transition pre-ETS services in their state or in their local school system. So interagency collaboration is and the need for it, and the fact that we have 2 research-based models are my big thoughts from what I heard in the presentations today. Now, we were able to look at the questions, some of the questions that were asked beforehand, and in those questions, there were a couple of things around, what's the research and what are evidence-based or research-based practices for implementing pre-employment transition services. And that's where, as you think back to my first slide, that's what NTACT, one of the things that NTACT is all about. If you visit our website, which is transitionta.org, and I'm sure almost every one of you has already been there before, but in case you want to go back, we have on there an effective practices and predictors matrix, although today's probably not the best day to be presenting because we have it down for a week or so while we're updating updating the new practices and predictors that we found in the last year with our literature review. But that effective practices and predictors matrix includes special education research, vocational rehabilitation research, and school completion or graduation research. We're going to add career tech education, but we haven't gotten around to it. That's in the next few months. But if you're interested in effective, evidence-based, research-based, and promising practices from special ed, VR, and the school completion literature, it's on the matrix, and it's broken out by employment outcomes, education outcomes, and independent living skills outcomes, which are the 3 things that we need to be looking at in terms of post-school goals through IDEA. So within that, when the links are live, you can click on each link and it'll give you a description and a place to go get more information. If it's a practice, those are instructional practices that are often used in classrooms. They will give you a lesson plan starter so that teachers and other people who have to do lesson plans around say self-determination or self-advocacy, there are lesson plans for those. And then the predictors are from the correlational research that are programmatic things that happen in school that tend to provide, that are correlated with better post-school outcomes. So that we're a one-stop shop for research and evidence-based practices around implementing pre-ETS is the NTAX matrix. Along with that, for the predictors, we have something we call the Predictors Implementation Self-Assessment. And this is a tool that can be used by states or school systems to look at what they're doing in terms of secondary transition and to determine whether there are strengths or weaknesses, and if they have some weaknesses, how they want to improve those practices, those services they're providing to kids. So there are a couple of documents, a couple of things you can look at on our website in terms of the matrix and the PISA that can be used with schools, MVR programs, to determine whether they're doing a strong job of providing students with research and evidence-based practices that are implementing pre-employment transition services. So that's pretty much what I have to say. And with that, I will turn it back to Todd.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate your discussant comments about the information that the presenters offered. I want to thank Rich, Meg, and Purvi for their presentations. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started with the question and answer period. First, if you do have a question that you'd like the panel to answer, please put it into the widget, the question and answer widget that's on your screen. Second, we've had a question or two about whether the information here is going to be available, and both the PowerPoint slides and the webinar itself, which is being recorded, will be posted on Mathematica Center for Studying Disability Policy website. My colleague Leah Caraballo is going to be helping us with the question and answer period. Leah, do you want to give us the first question?
Yes, thank you, Todd. Our first set of audience questions are as follows. What are VR agency views on results of the work you are producing? How has the work affected systems alignment statewide?
I think this is a question for all of our presenters.
This is Purvi. I'll start.
This is Rich. I can take a quick crack at that based on our work experience. First of all, the survey that I described and a subsequent survey that we're now engaged in were both conducted with the approval and blessing, so to speak, of the state VR directors in those respective states. So from that perspective, they're very, very interested in knowing what this research will tell them. It's really too early to tell how it's affected state systems alignment statewide in any place, but I can tell you that there's a very strong interest in the state VR agencies to do this in the best way possible and use the research to guide their direction. I think there's a lot of, as Purvi's graph showed about the use of Prius, there's wide variation in the states about how they're being used, and I think that's where we need more research, and I think that's something that will tell us more about the collaboration that other people have talked about and Dave emphasized in his remarks. But the systems alignment will need to be informed by these things as we go. So my best answer to that second part of the question is to stay tuned.
Purvi?
Yes, I was going to agree with what Rich said. We spoke with agency staff at 10 VR agencies, and they were all, very willing to share their experiences and very supportive of the work that we were doing. And again, it is too soon. Like we're just, agencies are still scaling up their delivery of Pre-ETS. It's still too soon to know, as Rich said, stay tuned.
And Meg, any thoughts from the Think College perspective?
I would agree with Rich and Purvi that they are interested, And I just think we're really at the outset of some deep conversations we need to do at both the research level and the policy level, because I think we're still working through some of this. So certainly I've seen interest and engagement on it, but I also don't know that state VR agencies can lead the charge on digging deeper on these questions while they're simultaneously trying to implement the practices. So that's why centers like the ROTC and Dave's Center and the WinTAC are really critical in helping us take the conversation up, another 10,000 feet and really look more globally at these questions, which are critical, but it does take time for us to unravel it all.
Thanks, Meg. Leah, next question.
How effective are Pre-ETS? How can state agencies measure the effectiveness of Pre-ETS?
Purvi, this one may be for you.
Sure. So the regulations and the 5 specific Pre-ETS were based on some foundation of research that showed that these would be effective in improving outcomes for transition-age youth with disabilities. Having said that, we don't have any evidence yet on whether the current expansion delivery of Pre-ETS is effective in improving employment, enrollment in post-secondary education, and maybe even completion of high school. So I think it's important in the next few years to collect evidence and to maybe see if agencies can, as they're scaling up Pre-ETS, do so in a way that supports the production of rigorous evidence on what's effective.
Yeah, Todd, if I can just add to what Purvi said, I think, Dave Test, this is where I'm going to insert my work is good comment. Of the 5 Pre-ETS categories, work-based learning experiences is the one best supported by previous research, not related to Pre-ETS, but work experiences for youth with disabilities in high school is the most robust predictor of adult employment. So given the history of past research, it would suggest that that category of Pre-ETS would have the greatest influence on successful outcomes. We don't know that yet because Pre-ETS hasn't been around long enough, but we are studying that, and we're engaged right now with the state agency in Maryland under an RSA research grant looking at exactly that thing. How effective will work-based learning as a Pre-ETS category influence work outcomes? So once again, my admonition there is to stay tuned. But it's an important question to ask.
Thanks, Rich. And Dave, is there anything you want to follow up on with this question and these ideas, given NTAC's role?
Yeah,
both
I agree that the jury's still out. But I think if you could make the argument that Rich started to make, if you look at the predictors, of which there are 20 predictors, and I can't name them all off the top of my head anymore. Many of those predictors align very closely with the pre-employment transition services. So there is some argument that says that past research, correlational research, has demonstrated that if you do these things, students will have better post-school outcomes. Now, do we know about every little Pre-ETS and every little program that are being developed by states? No, and it's going to be a while. One thing that this made me think of, though, is that there is a new TA center that came out with all these other, the new VRC TA centers called PEQA, P-E-Q-U-A, and I can't remember what that stands for. But one of their jobs is to help VR do evaluations, and they're actually training cohorts of potential vocational evaluators, but not the traditional ones. These are people that can work within VR systems to evaluate the impact of what they're doing. And so it seems like that TA center may be something that people want to look into and to get in contact with, because that would be a wonderful TA center to begin to answer some of these questions.
Those are good points, Dave. PEQA stands for Program Evaluation and Quality Assurance, so it's the TA Center for that area. Leah, do you want to pull a question from the audience? Next question.
Sure. How should VR support the consumer in choosing the vendor or service provider that will be working directly with the student for services, job development, systematic instruction? When a VR agency requires the consumer to choose the vendor without information about vendor qualifications and quote-unquote fit with the consumer, leaving the due diligence up to the consumer who is unlikely to be equipped to make a well-informed evaluation.
And that would be a broader question for the group.
This is Purvi. I'm happy to give an example of a VR agency that's doing something to support consumers in this decision. When we spoke with staff at OOD, the Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, the VR agency in Ohio, they produce vendor report cards that are available to the public that have a number of statistics on the vendors. And they're not meant to just be a sort of letter grade A, B, C, D, like how successful is this vendor, but also provide information about the types of services they're providing, the types of industries, the areas of the state, the kinds of youth that or other clients that they're working with. And so that when a client is choosing a provider, they have a little bit more information available to them in making that decision.
Rich or Meg, any thoughts? Follow up?
Well, one thing, this is Meg, that I would want people to consider, and as we're starting to, we collect data on the current cohort of the model demonstration projects known as TPSIDs, and we're now collecting data on not only their VR partnership, but how many of the VR partnerships are providing pre-employment transition services to these students, how many of the students are high school students versus adults, and we will be able to connect and see ultimately the extent to which some of these pre-employment transition services impact students' outcomes. But I don't know the extent to which VR agencies that are not currently engaged with higher ed programs are looking at them as providers. So I'm almost flipping it, but I'm asking people to think about how can higher education programs that are serving both transitioning youth and adults with intellectual disability and autism be seen as one mechanism or one effective partner in providing pre-employment transition services, given that they're focusing on employment, they're focusing on career development and internships, and would meet those 5 categories, specifically post-secondary counseling. So I think it's really important to provide inform consumers to make good choices, but it's also incumbent on the VR agencies that are seeking out providers to consider who's already doing this and doing it well, whether it's the special education through the school district, whether it's the transition services that are sometimes county-based or state-based, or looking at maybe more diverse partnerships, including higher education programs that are serving these youth and adults.
And this is Rich again. If I could just emphasize a point that Meg just made. Remember in the research that I presented today that one of the things that was identified by counselors as being a need is better be able to engage employers. And so this suggests that there's a capacity issue that not only VR counselors but all of their partners, service providers and vendors and so forth, in order to be successful, they have to be good at engaging employers. So the answer to the first question here about supporting the consumer in choosing, the better we're able to identify those providers and vendors who are good at engaging employers, the better we'll be able to recommend it to students and their families who might be best positioned to help them pursue their careers.
Thanks, Rich. We had a question online about whether the slides are accessible. The slides themselves aren't, but there's a PDF version of the slides, and that is accessible, and you should be able to access that directly through the platform. Leah, what's the next question for the group?
In Alabama, there are no work readiness programs that are appropriate for students with the most complex support needs. What accountability requirements are in place to document efficacy of these programs, if any? These students need experiential strategies to benefit, not group instruction in classrooms.
Again, this could be for anyone on the panel.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't speak specifically to Alabama or any other state for that matter in terms of work readiness programs. But regarding individuals with most complex support needs, nothing in the Pre-ETS addresses that directly. But WIOA in theory is interested in addressing that in that service categories or intentionally included in WIA, especially customized employment, which is a very widely used strategy to help folks with the most complex support needs. And it is something also, along with discovery as a way of setting the stage for customized employment, are widely used for these individuals. So to the extent that service agencies and VR agencies can use those strategies well, they can begin to serve students with the most support needs. Also, there's a provision that the VR can spend their money, supported employment money, on students, and which would also be another avenue that might be beneficial to folks in this category. But I think, again, it's a great question because I think the issue here is the presumption of employability. We should presume that any student who wants to work, regardless of the degree of support needs, should be able to experience these things along with their peers. And so it's up to the system to apply these strategies in a way that will address that.
And this is Dave. The other piece of WIOA would be Section 511, which is the purpose is to sort of break the high school to sheltered employment pipeline, so that these students would probably end up in a sheltered employment if they don't get appropriate work readiness skills or work-based learning. And one of the things that is part of 511 is the need to try things out to get work-based learning experiences. So that piece of WIOA hasn't been talked about a lot, but Section 511 is there too.
Leah, what's our next question?
Do you have findings on connecting youth experiencing homelessness to vocational rehabilitation / employment?
And this may be related to youth with more complex service needs, which we just talked about with the last question.
I don't. Do you know?
I can't say that we have data related to student homelessness and employment and their connection to VR. So our data doesn't reflect that.
Yeah, nor does ours.
Does anybody know if the new 9/11 data has a flag for homelessness? I know that there's a number of risk factors included in the.
That's a good question.
Well,
I don't know.
Okay. If there is, then there might be the potential to study VR outcomes for homeless youth who have applied for VR. But the extent to which homeless youth and students are even aware of the resources that VR can provide is unclear.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Next question.
Next question.
Sure. As VR agencies expand business relations teams and functions, are VR counselors performing the functions of engaging employers in the transition process, or are other VR personnel doing so?
Yeah, I can only answer that from anecdotal information, but from what I've experienced in talking with VR agencies around the country, the answer to that is yes. They do it both ways. Some VR agencies have special business relation teams. Sometimes the VR counselors themselves do perform the function of engaging employers, and sometimes they vendor that activity out to community rehabilitation providers. Basically all of the above.
Leah, next question.
Sure. I have a question for Meg, this audience member writes. In the programs/colleges that you're studying, Meg, does the university charge the students with IDD additional fees, costs to receive the services?
Thanks for that question. This is Meg, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The tuition structure is very individualized, so in some cases there's just a package tuition that the students pay. In some cases there are additional fees for program services and supports that are specific to the higher education program serving the student with intellectual disability or autism. And the funding is diverse, so not all programs are funded in the same way, even in the same state. Often vocational rehabilitation and local education agencies are critical partners in the funding equation. If you want more information about the funding structures, we actually have information about how all of the individual TPSID programs craft their tuition, and those are available in the reports on the thinkcollege.net website.
Okay.
Thanks, Meg. We heard from two members of the audience. Appreciate your input here. That one of the WIOA barriers to employment is homelessness. So that is an indicator that's in the VR RSA 911 data. So it will be a special population that eventually we'll have information about, and we'll be able to look at the numbers related to how VR agencies work with that population. Leah, next question.
Sure. Our next question is, are these programs considered a quote-unquote recognized educational program to meet the definition of a student with a disability? This is referring to Pre-ETS, the person writes.
This is Purvi. I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but receipt of pre-employment transition services does not count, like the pre-employment transition services are not a recognized educational program. They're made available to students that are enrolled in recognized educational programs, meaning, secondary school. Anyone else have any?
This is Meg. In terms of the higher education programs, I would say that from my perspective, they would be, but I do know that there is some back and forth now related to how states are interpreting recent guidance that's come out from RSA about a recognized education program, and if the programs that are funded under the TPSID program or those that have received comprehensive transition program status, which meaning they can offer Title IV aid to their students, if those are deemed recognized education programs, and that has to do with the type of credential and the way the credential was defined in the legislation. One of the things that I think has been overlooked in interpreting this is in WIOA, in the preamble, they have specific clarification that says that the students who are attending or receiving vocational services or training services through comprehensive transition programs should be eligible for tuition and other services under WIOA. So in one part of the law, they say they should be, and in some interpretations of other guidance, it is less clear. So I think that needs to be worked through. But I will say most of the students who are receiving Pre-ETS are dually enrolled students. They are high school students who are transitioning youth, who are receiving those transition services and pre-employment transition services in the context of a college setting. But I don't think that in any way negates the fact that they would be deemed eligible students or students with disability.
Thanks, Meg. And we're out of time. I feel like we could go for another hour with the questions. Thanks to the attendees for submitting those questions. Thanks to our presenters and discussant. Hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. Be sure to let us know how you think we did by completing the electronic survey, which you'll receive at the close of the session. We do look at that information and use that to improve these forums. Thank you for your time, and have a good day.